Okay, well, it's 10:30, so we can go ahead and get started with our lecture. Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Moon. I'm a study abroad advisor at the Dornsife Office of Overseas Studies. Thank you for joining us for this lecture, which is called Brexit, Britain and the EU's Uneasy History and Uncertain Future with Dr. Simon Radford. We're pleased to co-host this event with the USC Political Science and International Relations Department and the USC London Office. We do send quite a few students abroad to the UK, so if anyone would like more information later regarding our programs, I'll put our web address in the chat. Please know that there will also be plenty of time for questions at the end of the session. We are going to keep everybody muted just since we're recording the event. So if you have a question, please type that in the chat box and we'll get to it at the end of the session in the Q&A portion. Okay, so before I introduce Dr. Radford, I'd like to turn things over for a moment to James Farrell of the USC London Office so that he can also introduce himself and some of the services that his office provides. So James, turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily. Hi, my name is James Farrell. I'm the director of the USC London Office. For those who don't know, we're the newest international office that we have. We're the 9th international office. And we're delighted to be co-sponsoring this event and to be hearing from Dr. Radford, who's a good friend of the office because, as I'm sure he'll tell you himself, he's also president of the Alumni Club here. So we work very closely with Simon on this side of the pond. A particularly warm welcome to all of the students from the UK, from Europe and Africa who are joining us this evening. It's quite a nice time for us to be joining, and I know that's appreciated. To be able to attend this lecture in the early hours of the evening rather than later at night is very welcome. So welcome to all of you and to everyone watching the recording as well. I won't keep you much longer than that. Just to say, I'm going to put my details in the chat. So if anyone would like to know any more about the USC London office and about how we support USC in Europe, please feel free to reach out to me and we can have a call and take it from there. So I'll put my details in the chat, but without further ado, I'll hand back to you, Emily.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, James. And now to introduce our speaker. A native Londoner, Dr. Simon Radford received his PhD from USC's Political Science and International Relations program. Simon brings a combination of perspectives from his academic background, a history of campaigning and writing about UK politics, and from work in industry as a strategy consultant. Simon has written for a variety of publications on political topics, from international studies perspectives and British politics journals to analysis and opinion articles for the likes of The Observer and New Statesman, amongst others. So Simon, thank you so much for joining us. Without further ado, I'm going to hand everything over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for everyone coming along today. And it's, on a personal note, lovely to see some familiar faces who, despite me having sort of spent many years at USC, probably making their life harder than it should be, are still finding the time and the willingness to come and see me speak. So I'm grateful for you all to making the time, and thank you for those who are students who are joining us too. I will do the usual thing of sharing screen. I'm sure you're all zoomed to death and know all about it so far. So let me just do this and then talk you through what I thought we could talk about today. So first of all, we're going to talk to you about who on earth is this person and why is he talking about this topic. A bit about a kind of a potted history of the UK and Brexit and how we got to the point of voting on whether to stay in or get out of the EU. And then I'm going to sort of talk about some different explanations that have been going about as to why it all took place. And then finally, something about what's next for the UK and the EU. My aim is not to take up all the time talking because while I love the sound of my own voice, I'm sure you'll get sick of it. And I'd love to open it up to have a discussion and a question and answer session from you guys, because while the vast majority of Brits put their fingers in their ear and go la 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 when the topic of Brexit is now brought up, I know there's still a lot of questions and a lot of interest in working out how on earth we got to this point in the United States. I know there's been quite a lot of coverage for something UK related over there, and I'd love to be able to have a chat with you about how you see it as well, which will be a kind of an angle which we don't often get actually in the UK. So Who am I? As Emily said, I'm a kind of a Londoner, born and bred from North London, where I am currently. A proud USC alum. I did my PhD in the Political Science and International Relations program at USC. I graduated 2016, which seems like yesterday, but actually is a while ago. And I've sort of published on various things to do with British politics, including writing, as Emily said, for newspapers and magazines, but also writing academically, particularly on the House of Lords and how people get admitted to the House of Lords. I've worked in Parliament, which is something which, again, maybe gives me a kind of an interesting perspective on this. So I worked for a guy called Charles Kennedy, who was leader of the Liberal Democrats and was a very vocal pro-European, and sat next to Ted Heath, who we'll talk about, who was Prime Minister in the UK in the 70s and had some interesting perspectives on that. I was actually in Parliament when 9/11 happened, which was quite a strange experience. I ran for Parliament, or stood for Parliament, as we often say in the UK, in 2005. So I was one of the youngest candidates running for Parliament in Enfield North, which is also in North London. Worked in the city, and obviously the future of the city and the future of the City of London, and London as a financial centre has been a major topic of conversation in terms of Brexit. And currently I work for a company called Founders Intelligence in London, who work with corporates to help them partner, acquire, or invest in startups to help them drive innovation. And again, rather like the City of London, London's become something of an innovation and a startup hub partly because of its universities, partly because of finance and various other things. So it's also going to be interesting to see what happens in that regard. And then I put semi-bored of Brexit. It's one of those things, I suppose we've just come off an election campaign in the US. The number of people you find who are persuadable or who have changed their mind on Brexit is probably about the same amount as the number of people who have changed their mind or rethought their opinion on Trump. It kind of tends to be that there's a bit of a dialogue of the deaf when people debate Brexit, especially online, because we know online debates are particularly fruitless. That being said, there are some interesting things, some interesting people with new perspectives on Brexit, and it's particularly nice to talk to people who aren't set in their ways about Brexit, which this is going to be. So I'm looking forward to having an interesting discussion on Brexit rather than being berated by either a relative who's very Brexity or a relative who's very Remainy. So a bit of potted history. I suppose we should start before the EU or EEC or the EC was even an idea, and talk quite glibly about hundreds of years of British foreign policy in regards to the continent. Clearly, we could give an entire lecture on Britain's foreign policy towards Europe since 1066 and the Norman conquest. But it's fair to say the general sort of consensus, I suppose, especially amongst people you might call realists, has been that the UK has been what's called an offshore balancer. It's been very concerned essentially with the English Channel, as you can see, separating it from the continent, that no one other hostile power should occupy all of Europe and therefore be able to use it as a launching point for an invasion of the UK. And we saw, whether it was beating Napoleon or whether it was the Battle of Britain, Britain's had a couple of close shaves with people who have had exactly that ambition. But perhaps this sort of attitude is best summarized by Lord Palmerston, who is the hairy, hirsute chap on this slide, who said that Britain has no permanent allies, only permanent interests. We would team up with the French to beat the Germans, team up with the Germans to beat the French, and team up with the Americans when the French can't hold up their end of the bargain against the Germans. So as ever, Britain has always regarded itself somewhat in opposition to the continent and partly suspicious of political ideas brewing on the continent. And that partly is a historical frame which is important to be aware of when thinking about Brexit. So the 40s and 50s, and the story really, I think, begins really sort of post-war. So Britain's obviously sort of exhausted and devastated by the end of the war. It's borrowed up to the hilt. It's bombed, as you can see, to smithereens during the Blitz. And it's got a particular set of issues which it needs to concentrate on, including, rationing, rebuilding, and in a number of ways, an empire where slowly nationalism and other forces are starting to help it unravel. So while the conversations about a new European future kind of start in the beginning of the 50s, Britain's kind of not really part of the conversation in the same way. It's convinced maybe somewhat of the superiority of its own economy, partly perhaps because it was a victor in the war, and the strength of its ties with the US, particularly sort of Churchill and Roosevelt and later Truman's relationship. Churchill talks about the Anglophone and the Commonwealth and the Empire, and still there is this idea that this is Britain's future, that Britain is still a world power, and that it doesn't need to effectively cede sovereignty in any meaningful way with European partners who either were conquered or were the conquerors in the war and caused so much pain and loss of life. So as the Schuman Plan starts, which is started to sort of look at ways that Europe could start coordinating again to put an end to the Second World War happening ever again, there starts being the idea of the Coal and Steel Pact, where the explanation for the war was somewhat that large corporations which sort of looked after coal and steel, that in order to gin up employment and in order to sort of get an economy going from the dregs, a kind of a war economy would start by sort of piling into armaments, and then that would set off a security spiral which would lead to conflict. A way of allaying this, so the Schuman Plan thought, was to sort of merge, I think amongst 5 main countries, their coal and steel industries, so that it wouldn't become competitive, so that everyone would have transparency over who was doing what, and so that it wouldn't turn into a security spiral again. But the UK is not really involved in these conversations, and neither is it particularly involved 5 years later in preparation of the Treaty of Rome, which is the thing which founds the EC, which takes place in Messina in 1955. Into the 60s, attitudes have started to change. One of the ends of Britain's self-esteem as an imperial power and as a world power is the Suez Crisis in the 50s. And for those who don't know, again, it could be a subject of an entire lecture, but essentially Britain and France secretively decide to seize the Suez Canal, worried about NASA kicking Britain out of its former imperial possessions. But the US don't take kindly, especially on the Eisenhower administration, to the UK and France teaming up with Israel to act in a old imperialistic fashion, and essentially stop them from going ahead with their plan. And this sort of breach of trust in the UK, as far as they were conceded with the US, where they've put their own national interests above solidarity with the UK, albeit many in the UK thought the US were acting more honourably than the UK in going ahead with the plan to begin with, but also with its inability to act independently of other world powers, makes it realise that perhaps it should look to Europe for more equal footing partners and allies in the years ahead. So preparation is made to perhaps start courting particularly the French and the Germans to go into what will become the EU. So there's in 1959, a Conservative government under Harold Macmillan is elected. Macmillan makes it a priority to try and get into Europe. And partly due to the superior performance of European economies, they really sort of zoomed ahead in the post-war world, where Britain was still recovering very slowly from the war, was still having austerity and rations for a very long time. The mechanization of German industry in particular meant that the German economy whooshed ahead of the UK, and attitudes towards their European partners started to change, a certain amount of envy rather than a certain amount of smugness. And the Kennedy administration particularly encouraged the UK to act as a bridgehead into Europe, which was both a blessing and a curse, because while they had the US's endorsement and encouragement to join the EC, equally this role as an English-speaking bridgehead into Europe is seen by suspicion by de Gaulle in this photo, who worries after Macmillan applies for membership in 1962 that Britain would be not a bridgehead but a Trojan horse for American domination in Europe. If you read the very long but worthwhile Kissinger History of Diplomacy, he talks about how Britain tries to get influence with the US by almost operating as a second Secretary of State. And you can see Blair in Iraq as a great example of someone who wants to work in lockstep with the US in order to gain influence. The French's sort of strategy was always to be as much of an irritation as possible, so the US had to pay attention to what the French thought and wanted. And de Gaulle was a master at that. And so de Gaulle offers le grand non and says no to the UK's application, vetoing their application to join in January 1963. In 1964, a new government, Labour, comes to power under Harold Wilson. Fun fact, Wilson is the only shared last name of both an American president and a UK prime minister. Use that on your parents, maybe it's not that fun a fact. But anyway, Hugh Gaitskell, his predecessor as Labour leader, had been opposed to EEC membership, partly because he wanted to oppose Macmillan and make him a hard time, partly on sovereignty grounds. So Wilson, who wanted to reorient his party's attitude towards the EC, had to work somewhat to change party opinion. And so by 1967, the economic disparity was so stark between economic growth in the continent and the UK's own performance that Wilson could get all party support in the Commons to apply again to join the EC. And the motion passes in the Commons by 487 votes to 26. So quite substantial. But 6 months later, de Gaulle vetoes again. But however, two events alter the situation. De Gaulle is finally replaced by Pompidou as French Prime Minister. You might know him by the Pompidou Center, which is in Paris and looks like it's been made inside out. And Heath becomes Conservative Prime Minister in 1969. Heath had served in World War II and had an attitude that the World War II should never happen again and was very much pro-European. So the 1970s starts off with rather better political terrain in order to try and get Britain into the EEC. Heath hits it off with Pompidou. Pompidou has less of an animus against the US than de Gaulle has. In fact, I think Pompidou worked for various investment banks which were based in the US. I think even the Rockefellers at one point. 18 months of negotiations take place, and Heath later passes a motion to join the EEC. 40 Tories vote against it, but 69 Labour MPs, headed up by Roy Jenkins, who was a sort of party grandee, Home Secretary and Chancellor under various Labour governments, all vote in favour of joining. So while there's a split, again, there's a sort of bipartisan sort of consensus to join the EEC. There isn't a referendum, despite hints by Heath that he would hold one if they were to join. There are debates which weren't had and were had during this time. And some of it's worth maybe stopping here just to say briefly, there's lots of mythology and about what did or didn't take place during this period of time in terms of what issues were and weren't raised, what promises were and were not made, and lots of the calls for another referendum, which we had recently after this one, was because this one was somehow insufficient in terms of either raising issues which should have been, or that the European institutions have changed so dramatically, or that there had been such a generational shift that another one deserved to be held. But it's worth mentioning that the EC, of course, which the UK joined, was very different to the EU, which it left in many ways. And I think both advocates and detractors of the EU would probably say as much. So debates about the supremacy of European laws, for example, there's a UK case called Factor Tame, which said that when there's a conflict between UK law and European law takes precedence. Those sort of debates aren't held about sovereignty and about technical natures of law. Mainly it's held on economic grounds and about EC being a vehicle for the modernization of UK economy. And the UK at the time was called the sick man of Europe by The Economist. There were more strike days lost, for example, than in Germany, despite a much bigger population. And the EC was seen as a way of, maybe by osmosis, maybe by policy, trying to get some of the better habits that had seen the European economies race ahead. Harold Wilson, despite having applied to join the EC when he was Prime Minister, had opposed the bill in opposition. And again, you see this quite a lot, whether it's opportunistically or not. Labour again opposed the Maastricht Treaty in the 90s, for example, despite being ostensibly a pro-European party. So when he becomes Prime Minister, he has to try and renegotiate the terms. Now, lots of people say that this renegotiation was sort of a phony renegotiation, but if he'd opposed the bill, he couldn't very much become Prime Minister and then all of a sudden say, actually, I'm good with it. So he held another negotiation again with Pompidou and then decides to hold a referendum. And you can see some of the scenes from that in this slide here. So worth talking quickly about some of the things you can see here. So obviously the referendum results up on the board on the left, 64% turnout in the end for this referendum, which was comparable to a general election turnout. 67% of the public decide that they approve of the idea of going into the EEC. And you'll see that there were very many prominent conservatives who were very much in favor of joining Europe. You might know who the young lady is in the middle of those three, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher held up as the iconic Eurosceptic by some of her descendants and disciples nowadays, actually was at the forefront of the campaign to join the EEC back in the day. For those of you with too much time in your hands, there is a series of pictures of Margaret Thatcher in a quite jaunty EEC-related sweater, which you can see online with all the different flags of the European countries on. Probably not going to make a fashion comeback. To her right is Willie Whitelaw, who later became her deputy prime minister. And in the picture below, three iconic Labour left-wingers. You have Michael Foot, who has the longer hair with the glasses sitting down. He later becomes Labour leader in the early 1980s. Tony Benn, famous Labour socialist, sitting down and looking up. And you had the beast of Bolsover, Dennis Skinner, who was a very long-serving Labour MP and Eurosceptic, also known as one of the funniest men in the Commons, who would often heckle people in quite funny ways. So you had this other people who aren't on this slide and worth talking about. Enoch Powell was a prominent Tory MP, was an Oxford Don, classicist, who had he was on the right of the party and had a large following. He, however, made a speech talking about the dangers of immigration, where he said, like the Roman, I see the rivers of the Tiber frothing with much blood, warning about that immigration would lead to blood on the streets, and advocating repatriation of ethnic minorities back to the countries from which they came. There was a large amount of waves of immigration, of course, all through Britain's history, but particularly after the war, there was a lot of Irish immigration and then a lot of Caribbean immigration, especially what's called the Windrush generation, who came over and worked on Britain's buses, worked on the underground, worked as nurses, and there was a lot of community tensions which came with this, as people weren't, certainly sort of some working class right-wing elements formed the National Front and other fascist groups. Enoch Powell's speech meant that he was sacked from the government by Ted Heath, and actually later joined what's called the Ulster Unionist Party, which is a kind of conservative party in the north of Ireland who decided to have him instead. And he was a very prominent member of the campaign to not join the EEC. So you had very iconic, but were seen as somewhat non-mainstream figures in Tony Benn and Enoch Powell from either party, left, far right, opposing the EEC, variously either as a papist plot or as a banker's plot. You know, it was called a capitalist club, and if you wanted to build socialism, we couldn't join it. So there was sort of maybe non-compatible arguments from either side of the political spectrum. And then you had a sort of cabinet members and former cabinet members, mainstream, should we say, political figures, whether it was Thatcher or Roy Jenkins from either party, arguing for yes. And so this maybe partly explains why there was an over 2/3 majority to join the EC in 1975. So that leads us into the 1980s. There's the jaunty sweater I promised you. You don't have to Google it. I found it for you. But here you'll see two very different quotes. So on the left, it's a conservative Remain group who are quoting Margaret Thatcher saying, "It is purely common sense to belong to a community working together in peace on economic and political issues that concern us all." And then on the right, with that sort of slightly haunting half smile, Thatcher is quoted as saying, "The European Union is not based on a common language, culture and values. It is a result of plans. In fact, it is a classic utopian project, a monument to the vanity of intellectuals, a program whose inevitable destiny is failure. Only the scale of the final damage done is in doubt." So rather like you can find almost any quote and attribute it to Churchill if you Google long enough. Equally, you will find people quoting Margaret Thatcher as a reason to be pro-European and to be anti-European just as well. And that's partly because she had a complicated history with it. So as you saw, she was part of the campaign to join. She becomes Prime Minister in 1979, and she reduces exchange controls, and the City of London booms and does lots and lots of European deals. So London and the City of London becomes Europe's preeminent financial hub during the 80s. Some would say for better or worse, because it starts the process of perhaps hollowing out manufacturing as Thatcher privatizes large state-owned companies, which sheds workers. Manufacturing, just as with Reagan in the early 80s, is hammered with high interest rates to reduce inflation. That means that lots of manufacturing manufacturing heavy areas, suffer from mass unemployment. A place called Consett in Northumberland, I think at one point had 98% unemployment. Thatcher's party chairman, Norman Tebbit, famously told them to get on their bike and find a job, showing a conspicuous lack of empathy for those struggling to find work after their sort of union jobs had gone. So there are some sort of structural changes under Thatcher. She also recovers 2/3 of the UK's disproportionately high contribution to the EEC, which is seen as a great victory for Thatcher. That both either, you could say, cements the logic of Britain remaining in the EU or the EEC because it was better value for money, but equally sets us up in opposition to the EEC, that it's all about what we put in and what we get out, as opposed to a larger political plan. And then she works with a guy called Jacques Delors, who becomes the president of the European Union eventually, who was a French politician who became something of a tabloid enemy in Britain because of his very pro-European views. But Thatcher works with him to sign the Single European Act in 1987, which is possibly the most pro-European piece of legislation ever signed in the UK, and was signed by Margaret Thatcher. And it was seen as a way of removing barriers to services and to financial services in particular throughout the EU. So while it contains lots of provisions to deepen integration within the EU, and in fact it it helps leads up to Maastricht, which turns the EEC into the EU. It's also somewhat ironic that Thatcher is the person who pioneers it, because she will later rail against the provisions in it in terms of its political implications. Part of what happened with the Single European Act was the launch of something called the exchange rate mechanism. Now, I know you all love a bit of monetary policy history, but bear with me, it's actually kind of interesting / important. So the idea of the European exchange rate mechanism was sort of a precursor to what became the euro. And obviously when they had the euro, they gave up independent interest rates and had a European bank which set interest rates. But they didn't want to do it all in one go. So essentially what they said was, let's try and allow for exchange rates between our currencies to not fluctuate very much, because that was seen as the major benefit of a single currency in the end, was that people could export and plan businesses across different currency areas, and whether it's the pound or the franc or the Deutschmark, if it didn't fluctuate very much, then you could plan ahead, you can invest, and you could grow. So the idea was to keep it between an upper and a lower bound. So you could imagine these currencies fluctuating up and down between these two bands. And it was called the snake in the hole, or the snake in the tunnel, often because you could imagine this currency going up and down between these two bands, a bit like a snake going through a pipe. Nigel Lawson, who was Thatcher's chancellor, or one of Thatcher's chancellors, very much advocated joining it, as did very many other pro-European cabinet members in Thatcher's government. She opposed it, and Lawson started shadowing the Deutschmark anyway, which very much upset Thatcher and led to one of the rifts, which eventually meant that she was overthrown. In fact, one of the precipitating events that saw her overthrown as Prime Minister and Conservative Party leader was the resignation of her Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, who was an original Thatcherite and a true believer in Thatcherism in terms of lower taxes and privatization. He was pro-European, went to all these European summits, trying to find ways to collaborate, trying to find ways to work together for positive sum outcomes. And Thatcher very much saw it as increasingly as a French-German stitch-up, and that she would oppose what they were trying to do and loudly sort of denounce what they were trying to do. And in his resignation speech, he said in a very British way that it was rather like being sent out to bat by only to find that your captain had broken the cricket bat before you went out to the crease. If you don't understand that, don't worry, you'll have to learn more about cricket. But it's basically saying that Thatcher had sabotaged his own negotiations in Europe. Geoffrey Howe, who's a sort of genial old figure with a shock of grey hair, gets up and gives this resignation speech in the Commons. It's electrifying. It's seen as the beginning of the end of a rebellion against Thatcher's high-handed attitude towards her cabinet. One Labour MP, Dennis Healey, said that she had been savaged by a dead sheep because he was so calm and had that shock of grey hair. But eventually, a series of her cabinet members go to visit her and say that her time is up. Eventually, while Thatcher sort of had managed to stay out of the ERM and the single currency, her hand-picked successor was John Major, who was her final chancellor, who was still somewhat pro-European. And so he takes over in 1990, and Thatcher gives her final Prime Minister's question appearance before Major takes over. And it kind of summarizes maybe late stage Thatcher when it comes to her attitude towards Europe.
It is our purpose to retain the power and influence of this House and not to denude it of many of the powers. I wonder what the right honourable gentleman's policy is in view of some of the things he said. Would he have agreed to a commitment to extend the community's powers to other supplementary sectors of economic integration without having any definition of what they are? Would he? Because you would have thought he would from what he said. One of them was that the Commission wants to extend its powers and competence into the area of health. We said no, we weren't going to agree to those things. From what he says, he sounded as if he would. for the sake of agreeing, for the sake of being little Sir Echo and saying me too. Would he have agreed to extending qualified majority voting within the council, to delegating implementing powers to the commission, to a common security policy, all without any attempt to define or limit them? The answer is yes. He hasn't got a clue about the definition of some of the things he is saying, let alone securing a definition of others. Yes, the Commission does want to increase its powers. Yes, it is a non-elected body, and I do not want the Commission to increase its powers against this House. So, of course, we are differing. Of course, the chairman or the president of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community. He wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no. Perhaps the Labour Party would give all those things up easily. Perhaps they would agree to a single currency, to total abolition of the pound sterling. Perhaps being totally incompetent with monetary matters, they'd be only too delighted to hand over the full responsibility, as they did to the IMF, to a central bank. The fact is, they have no competence on money, no competence on the economy. So yes, the right honourable gentleman would be glad to hand it all over. And what is the point in trying to get elected to Parliament only to hand over your sterling and to hand over the powers of this House to you?
So that was Thatcher's famous no, no, no speech, where she sets out opposition to Jacques Delors' plan to establish a European Parliament, which she said would act as a legislature, to the Commission, which she said would operate like a kind of a government or an executive, and also the Council of Ministers, which would operate as well with qualified majority voting, which means that if a majority of European states want to go with something, then no one can veto it. So you saw some of the classic sort of Thatcher stands here, but other things to notice are this increasing political integration is seen as a step change and different to the free trade area, which some conservatives in particular thought they were signing up to. In reality, Europe has always been a political project. Britain, maybe you could argue, tried to have its economic cake and eat it without taking part in the political project. But clearly, as European integration deepens, Britain becomes more and more and more uneasy about it. And that's both on economic grounds. Thatcher says that she didn't roll back the frontiers of the state at home only to see them being reimposed at the European level. So partly it's about what she thought as creeping socialism or creeping social democracy at the level of the EU, when she wanted to have a more small state approach. Partly it's also on sovereignty grounds. You heard she said that she wanted health and security and other things to be decisions to be taking part in Westminster and not in Europe. And that was still very much a debate which resonates today about so-called democratic deficit in Europe, where there was Britain's first past the post system. One of the virtues of it, and there are many arguments for and against it, is that if you want to get rid of a government, you can get rid of a government. One of the arguments with Europe is that you could never actually sort of get rid and reverse course of the powers that be in Europe, that it was always another step of integration, another step of integration. But John Major takes over. As you can see, the British tabloid press keep up this sort of anti-European campaigning. The Sun, in particular, which I think probably people might forget, some of our younger listeners forget, that sort of the power of Britain's newspapers, which used to get read or delivered to people's doors every single day. Maybe it's the sort of talking about sort of what role Facebook and Twitter and other things take place in terms of political debates today. The tabloid press and its relentless campaign against the European politicians and institutions were incredibly influential. And then Britain joins the exchange rate mechanism. It joins late, and it joins possibly too high in terms of what level it should join in. And George Soros, the famous hedge fund manager, along with some other famous money managers. In fact, the Omega Fund, which Soros ran at the time, probably had one of the greatest collection of fund managers of all time, realized that essentially if it sold pounds and bought Deutschmarks, then it could force Britain to go out of this, to breach the walls of the tunnel in which the pound was meant to keep within, and force a devaluation. And in the meantime, the Bank of England and the Treasury were trying to do the opposite to keep it within these bounds. But eventually this hedge fund had more money than Britain had political willingness. So you can see Norman Lamont, who was John Major's chancellor there, announcing the devaluation of the pound, announcing Britain leaving the European exchange rate mechanism. And in the back, slightly tanned for some reason, you might make out his political advisor, who was a young David Cameron. A bit like Woody Allen's Zelig, if you've ever seen it. He seems to pop up everywhere where interesting things are happening and not always going according to plan. And in the bottom picture as well, you will see various Tory backbenchers who, when John Major wins the election in 1992, it's very much a surprise. And he wins with a small majority. And again, we'll see this, the sort of Britain's domestic politics play a large role with this. So John Major passes the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, setting up these European institutions, but getting an opt-out of the single currency and what's called the social chapter. But various Tory rebels, who are pictured here, voted against Maastricht and continued to have a campaign against John Major to get rid of him and to try and reverse course on Europe. And some of these characters are still prominent in conservative Eurosceptic circles today, including John Redwood, who's sitting down at the table there. So over the course of the 90s, Denmark also votes against the Maastricht Treaty famously in 1992 and calls Gro for a referendum on Maastricht, which John Major, I think, realizes probably wouldn't work out according to plan. And so he says no to that referendum. And then the John Major's Conservative government in sort of, I guess, bumbles along over the course of most of the 90s. Kenneth Clarke, a very famous pro-European who had opposed Thatcher's Euroscepticism, becomes Chancellor under Major. And after the devaluation, Britain's economy starts to grow again, but because of a lot of scandal, sleaze, and otherwise incompetence, and a sense that the Tories have been totally out of ideas, the Conservative government sort of bumbles along until 1997, when Tony Blair takes over. You can see our Tony there. So Tony Blair comes to power with New Labour in 1997. They sign up to the social chapter in Maastricht's other things. They also talk about perhaps joining the single currency, but Gordon Brown, his chancellor, who I know is a friend of USC, and I've been delighted to meet while I was at USC as well, sets 5 tests which Britain has to pass to join the euro. And some would say they are deliberately put together so that Britain would never pass it, and so that he would have veto power over the Prime Minister. And this is one of the major causes of conflict between number 10 under Tony Blair and number 11, where the Chancellor lives, under Gordon Brown. The Murdoch press, which Tony Blair had also been at pains to court to try and get Labour back into power, was also clearly against the single currency, was very much against the EU, really. So it's also one of those things that Labour are a bit scared of going too far on Europe, despite, I think, the optimism of many European countries at the time. And equally, there were some people at the time who were very sympathetic to Tony Blair's way of doing politics. Gerhard Schroeder in Germany and Lionel Jospin in France were advocates of the third way, a kind of very moderate form of social democracy, which essentially stole some of the clothes of the Conservative parties which they had opposed in order to get back into power. However, fast forward to 2008, and a financial crisis essentially kills the Labour Party and their reputation for economic competence they had enjoyed huge amounts of growth, low inflation. One of the things which happens under Labour as well, which plays a big role into things, is that there's an expansion of the EU to the east. So include Poland, Romania, Bulgaria and other places. And Britain's one of the, I think the only country, or one of very few countries, to not put any restrictions on movement from these old countries to the new. And obviously they were a lot poorer than the UK and Western Europe. So all of a sudden you had sort of hundreds of thousands of Poles and Romanians and others coming to the UK, often settling in, you know, as people do in the same areas where they know people. And this causes quite a consternation in the British tabloid press, where every day there are stories about, you know, Romanians and crime, or Poles taking British jobs and various other things. And so this fear about immigration starts building up again and again and again, and plays a very large role in the referendum. 2010, there is a coalition government between David Cameron and Nick Clegg, a Liberal Democrat. The Liberal Democrats were probably Britain's most pro-European party. David Cameron is Eurosceptic enough to be elected leader of the Conservative Party, but he's not really a true believer Eurosceptic like some of his backbenchers. But there are various things which he has to bear in mind. So you have a rise of a right-wing splinter party with some of the more headbanging Thatcherite anti-Europeans with UKIP. I believe Nigel Farage keeps popping up on Fox News these days, but UKIP and the Brexit party under Farage start taking votes off Conservatives in winnable seats. So he's worried about that. And also what happens with the EU and Greece, where Greece is humiliated because of the design of the single currency. You can see Yanis Varoufakis meeting George Osborne, who was Chancellor at the time. And so both actually Nick Clegg and David Cameron promise a referendum on continuing membership of the EU for the 2015 election. So there's some talk that Cameron was willing to do so because he thought that he'd be in coalition again and could blame the Lib Dems for not being able to actually follow through. But the Conservatives win a small majority and agree to hold a referendum. As we know what happens with the referendum, it's worth talking about how it went the way it did, 2 votes to leave the EU. So the first is some arguments that maybe what drove the referendum result are primarily culture. So there's the north of Europe, which has been more Protestant historically. You know, there's some arguments about whether they're happy with the sort of subsidiarity and the layers of authority that the sort of Central European or continental European powers are more okay with. Some arguments that that's why Denmark and Sweden and the UK and others are traditionally more Eurosceptic. The experience of the war, you know, obviously if you've been invaded or if you'd been the EU as an antidote and a salve to the experience of war happening again is felt differently in the UK as it is to the continent. This idea of, we talked about with Thatcher, about limited government and about rather than creating a big social Europe with safeguards and all the rest of it too, that actually you want to have a smaller government and that's incompatible at the same time. British people, and I'm no exception, are notorious in their total inability to speak other languages because of the prominence of English. Whereas if you go to Holland, they tend to speak better English than we do half the time. So this inability to actually converse with other people on the continent perhaps limits our ability to feel a certain amount of fellow feeling and solidarity with them to form a kind of more political demos. I'll link to the Commonwealth in America. So you can, and also the last thing to say is the number of people, even when we were members of the EU, who would say, oh, what are you doing this weekend? And they go, oh, I'm going to Europe, as if Britain wasn't part of Europe. There's kind of interesting linguistic cultural frame that Europe was somewhere else and not here. So there are various cultural explanations for why the vote went the way it was. There's also some cultural or political psychology way of looking at this. So on the right, you'll see that kind of funky looking bar and whisker chart. One of the interesting fun things about this is they asked about the probability of having voted for Brexit. And then they said, should children be considerate or should they be well behaved? If you said well behaved, then you're more likely to vote for Brexit. If you said consider it, you're more likely to have voted to remain. And there's something about, if you look at the big 5 personality scores, if you're open to new experience, if you have more of a culture or a moral taste of looking after people, you're going to be more likely to be remain. So some people say, even allowing for various other things, culture plays a big difference and psychology plays a big difference. And you can see it with some of these battery of questions which look at our deeper values too. Economics is a big part, and a lot of people talk about that. So you have as we've had in a lot of the West at the moment, with 0 interest rates and probably slightly too low interest rates since Greenspan, who doesn't get enough abuse for this, so I will mention it here. Keeping interest rates low, we moved to kind of an asset bubble economy, and that meant the British house prices went through a bubble, particularly in the southeast. And also with the rise of finance and stock bubbles, it meant that more and more activity was essentially going to London. It was almost like a plug hole of activity. And this was resented outside the metropole, especially in the regions in the northeast, which used to make it the world's ships in Sunderland and Newcastle. It used to have factories. It used to do all kinds of things, and now increasingly hollowed out into a few sectors like financial services and media focused in London, driven by this bubble economy. Again, we talked a bit about immigration and perhaps what that might mean for at least the perception that there is a threat to wages amongst those who are lower skilled. And again, we see that sort of north-south divide, which you'll see in the results, both in terms of stuff like life expectancy, in terms of earnings, and also in terms of government spending. So in a world where government makes investment decisions based on cost-benefit analyses, it's hard to therefore create economic value by spending infrastructure in areas if a cost-benefit analysis can't be made to work. So it tends to be that infrastructure followed economic activity rather than infrastructure being put in place in order to inspire economic activity. And that meant that there was an increasingly widening gap between North and South. You can see this in terms of the results from the last map to this: wealth distribution, economic activity, various other things focused in the South. We'll talk a bit about Scotland as well, who perhaps saw Europe as a way of not being dominated by an increasingly conservative England. But you can see it basically in all kinds of maps, that the university towns, which are fairly rich, and London in the southeast, and commuting towns close to London, voting Remain, and large swaths of the rest of England in particular, voting to leave. Was it a rational result? So there was the seats which voted to leave have since been called the Red Wall, because the Conservatives won them at the last election, despite the fact they've been historically very Labour and very left-wing. One of the reasons why they said they may have voted to leave was essentially they'd had one-party rule in terms of who their MPs were for a very long time, that a lot of these working class constituencies had been forgotten. They'd had MPs imposed from London, from various people close to the political action in London, would get a nice safe seat somewhere up north where they'd never been, commute into London. And that this was a sort of a rational result, a kind of a cry for help not to be ignored anymore. And that was exacerbated by Britain's electoral system. Equally, one could just say that the promises which the vote leave people asked for were in the rational interest of the majority of people. And you can see some of those. Of course, you'll find no more contentious argument than something like that. Put it on the internet and watch people scream at you. And then domestic politics. There's all kinds of things going on here, whether it was, were attitudes and other things shaped by the campaign, by political leaders. You see Nigel Farage there, who credits himself, of course, with Brexit. There is an argument that if it wasn't for particular domestic politics and domestic leaders, that this would never have happened. Thomas Piketty, who you'll probably be aware of, famous French economist, has also written that this is part of something that's happening across the West, where left-wing sort of parties are increasingly dominated by cosmopolitan sort of middle-class and upper-middle-class elites, and working-class former left-wing members are being seduced towards the right. And if you think that Europe is essentially seen as a proxy to club the cosmopolitan elites who hadn't been listening, then this is also an argument for why Brexit happened, and probably one of the more realistic ones. So what next for the UK and the EU? Well, this was taken in 2014, but it does seem public support for a federal Europe is actually pretty low in a lot of places. And one of the theories is the EU kind of salami slices its way to a more and more of a federal structure. So while the euro was set up without, for example, fiscal transfers between countries and just monetary unity, now because we've had a crisis, we now have common debt denominated in euros, which is the first time that's ever happened. The Germans have finally agreed to it. Next, we might have a common European treasury. There is this argument that the closer and closer we get to essentially a single overarching European government, the more and more backlash there's going to be, and that Britain is just the first of many, because you can see other ones in deep red there, who will eventually have a backlash. Whether Europe without Britain is an interesting question, and will there be more Brexits? Even if Grexit didn't happen, will we see other countries go that way? Interestingly, will there be a change in Britain's domestic policy too? Labour were seen as being pro-European. Corbyn kind of tried to straddle both Brexit and Remain. Labour's new leader was very much seen as pro-European, but has backed the deal to leave. There is this idea that maybe Britain might be turning the page on Europe, even as some people are going to campaign to try and rejoin. And while Eurosceptics lost the referendum in the 70s, they won one in 2016. Perhaps too, in 40 years' time, there'll be another referendum and we'll vote to rejoin. But there's some debate about, particularly on the left, about should we accept the result? Should you see it as an opportunity? Should you just say, this has been a huge error and we need to rejoin? Perry Anderson, who's a famous sort of academic and commentator, has written a series of articles for the London Review of Books. I think it's coming in at over 40,000 words, but well worth your time if you have a year or two to spend reading it all, which I have, but on the history of Europe and particularly Britain's relationship to it, which I recommend to you on the London Review of Books. And finally, before we have questions, it's worth thinking that sometimes satire predicts things better than real politics does. So there was a famous British show in the 70s and 80s called Yes Minister, and later Yes Prime Minister. And it becomes Yes Prime Minister because Jim Hacker, a sort of hapless government minister, takes a stand against the European Union. And this is the video where he works out what issue he can use domestically to vaunt himself to power by grabbing the hearts of the British people.
I think I got the gist. Is that the lot? Apart from the ones waiting for your party headquarters. Party headquarters? I didn't do those last Christmas. Well, you weren't party chairman last year. Do I have to send this one? Why not? It's to Maurice in Brussels. He's the one who forced through the plan to standardise the Euro sausage. Euro? By the end of next year, we shall be waving goodbye to good old British sausage. We'll be forced to accept some foreign muck like salami or bratwurst or something in its place. But they can't stop us eating the British sausage, can they? They can stop us calling it the sausage, though. Apparently it's going to be called the emulsified high-fat offal tube. And you swallowed it? It's my job to implement EEC regulations. Finish my career. What have they got against our sausage? Dear. Don't you ever read the papers you give me? Well, if I glance at it, Minister, but it rather put me off. Apparently, there's not enough meat in it. The average British sausage consists of 32.5% fat, 6.5% rind, 20% water, 10% rusk, 5% seasoning, preservative and colouring, and only 26% meat, which is mostly gristle, head meat, other offcuts, and mechanically recovered meat steamed off the carcass. I had one for breakfast. Perhaps the EEC commissioner is right. Maybe right, but it'd be extremely unpopular with the voters. Oh, well, she'll just have to grit our teeth and bite on the bullet. You can't bite a bullet if you're gritting your teeth, Minister. You see, if you do that, you can't get the bullet.
A great example of Britain's cultural affinity or lack thereof to our European partners. So that's all I wanted to run through in terms of prepared remarks. I don't know how long we've got. I think I've gone a while, but maybe if we've got time for a couple of questions, I'll let Emily work out how much time we have left.
Great, yeah, we do have time. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box. In the meantime, we do have one from James. So to what extent has the decision to leave the EU jeopardized the Union itself? I'm talking about Scotland and Northern Ireland's membership of the UK.
Yeah, great question. So just a little bit of back context, I suppose. There was a referendum before the European referendum. In fact, it may have been a cause for it to happen because there was a Scottish independence referendum. Cameron claimed that he won it because they talked about economic issues rather than sovereignty issues, and that economic issues won the day to keep Scotland in the Union. And he thought that they could pull the same trick off again with Europe, and of course it went the other way. So there is a question now. Most of the polls look like actually pro-independence has gone up in the polls and now is supported by a majority. The big question with Scottish independence is the same kind of that it was before, which is, can it keep the pound or does it want to join the euro? Joining the euro is obviously sort of, the euro doesn't have the best reputation, should we say, at the moment, especially in the British press. If Scotland were to try and join the euro, that would be contentious, and that's still something which the Scottish National Party have struggled with in terms of messaging. But also, while Britain was in the European Union, Scotland had access to a large European-wide market beyond just the UK. So if you can have political sovereignty within a nation state, yet also have access to a European-wide market, that might be the best of both worlds. If you have political sovereignty and you've just cut off your market by getting rid of the rest of the UK and only having Scotland, then it might be seen as self-defeating. So a large part of it is going to depend on, would Scotland be able to rejoin the EU to be able to have access to that market? And if Scotland was going to rejoin the EU, what terms would the EU give it? So in some ways, the EU might think, well, let's be really nice to the Scottish because that will really be able to thumb our nose at the Tories and the rest of the Brits. But equally, it might say that we should seek rather more stringent terms, and that might put Scotland off doing it. So it remains to be seen. I think if I was a betting man, I think I would favour just about a vote for independence because the status quo is pretty unpopular, and I think change is more popular, and change can be associated with independence. But there are definitely some complicating factors with the European dimension that are important to mention.
Interesting. Does anyone else have any other questions to add? Fine, it seems like there's no other questions at the moment. Oh, sorry, there is one. So,
why don't I raise an issue which might be, oh yeah.
Well, we did just get one. Do you see Welsh independence taking stage following the lead of Scotland?
Good question. My father is from North Wales, so I have a particular interest in this. Plaid Cymru, which is the equivalent to the Scottish National Party, have never quite been as strong as the Scottish National Party are. There's still an affinity towards Labour as a unionist party in Wales in a way that is sadly no longer true in Scotland in some ways, although it's been undermined somewhat. Independence for Wales has always been slightly below Scotland, whether that's because Wales has been part of the UK longer, whether that's because lots of Welsh people travel back and forth to England more often than Scottish people do, or whether that's simply because Wales is smaller and arguably as an economy would have a harder time launching itself as an independent economy than Scotland might. One of the arguments for Scottish independence, very controversial, we don't have time to get into it, is how much North Sea oil would go to Scotland and how much would go to England. There's also a question of how much of it is left. But whenever you wanted to conjure up an economic business case for an independent Scotland, you always assume very optimistic revenue assumptions for oil in Scotland. Unless all of a sudden we can power the economy with sheep, you can't do the same sort of thing with Wales. So it's always a bit of a harder argument for Welsh independence than it is for Scottish independence, even though there's plenty of people who I'm sure would make that argument very forcefully.
Great. Thank you. So we have a couple
one
more.
thing to bring up too, and if I may bring up my own question and answer my own question, which is clearly cheating, but I'm going to do it anyway, is one of the things which is interesting is what happens to a free trade agreement between the United States and Britain now that it's left, because Joe Biden is, there's already stuff saying, well, Joe Biden's from an Irish background and Ireland's part of the EU, and they've been very annoyed with the UK's nonsense around negotiations and leaving, and maybe Joe Biden will take it out against the Brits. Equally, lots of people saying, but America's our oldest ally, and of course they said they'll give us a good deal. When Trump was in charge, there was both the thing that Trump believed in Brexit, so therefore he's going to be nice to us, and then also the Trump's a deal maker and he sees everything as a I win, you lose deal. It'll be interesting to see, and I don't know if anyone knows, and I'm not going to say, what the new administration's attitude towards a free trade agreement with the UK will be. There are various things, particularly about agricultural standards, that I think would be really controversial, but it's definitely something which Britain's paying a lot of attention to, even though I know the American public probably doesn't register on their map. But something to look out for if you're following this.
Great, and that was actually one of the next questions that was asked specifically, so that's perfect. Okay, we have another one. Let's see. What do you think is the future of the city now outside of the EU? City meaning London.
Good question. So, yeah. So London has two huge advantages. One of which is language, because many more people speak English than German. And time zone is another, that as New York closes, London opens, and then when London closes, Japan opens, or the other way around. I have to work out my time zones. But London's peculiarly well positioned in that way to be a financial hub. That being said, the EU, of course, will do their very best to steal away business from the City of London. So particularly, I think you've seen some moves for various markets to go from London to Frankfurt. One of the arguments might be that Frankfurt might want it and Paris might want it. So the usual solidarity and rivalry within the EU might mean that coordination is difficult in terms of who's making the pitch. But also I think there are, if you're the first to move out, you have to be pretty sure that other people follow. So there's also a bit of a coordination problem if everyone bolts. We've already seen some companies listed in Ireland or having a kind of a shell agreement in Ireland, so it has access to EU markets, even though it's operated kind of out of the UK. So one of the interesting things about being set up in the US Virgin Islands, or being set up in Ireland, or being set up in the Channel Islands, or being set up in whatever, there are clearly problems with a lot of this in terms of taxation and various things. But the flexibility it allows corporations to both essentially have a workforce in London, but also access the EU market is interesting. There are still going to be negotiations going forward about the role of the City of London, but a Conservative government is funded by, has dinner parties with, often draws its MPs from finance and the City of London, and it's likely that they are going to have a very pro-finance approach to any negotiations. The question is what they can get away with. Other people, of course, a lot of the people who voted for Brexit, of course, did so partly because they resent the banks and City of London and the amount of emphasis it had compared to manufacturing. So it's an interesting, they're going to probably not shout that loudly about it, but I think behind closed doors going to be lobbying very hard for continuing. There's a thing called passporting rights in particular, which they're going to be, I think, asking a lot about in terms of selling financial services to the rest of Europe.
All right, so looking across to Ireland, do you think there will be a resurgence of violence in Northern Ireland associated with renewed calls for a united Ireland following Brexit?
Good question. No one wants to be the person predicting violence, so I'm not going to predict violence. But obviously one of the big issues around Brexit was about what happens to the Irish border, and the Good Friday Agreement, one of the kind of cornerstone parts of it was essentially that there was an open border, that if you were a Republican and you were Catholic and you had family in the Republic, you could travel freely from the north of Ireland to the Republic. And I should say, If you're a Republican, you tend to refer to it as the north of Ireland, and if you're a Unionist, you tend to refer to it as Northern Ireland. So language is all very contentious in Northern Ireland too. I once went on an exchange to Northern Ireland and stayed with a Muslim family, which was an interesting wrinkle to the usual Catholic-Protestant divide. But anyway, so what were the things which might set things off? Well, at the moment, Sinn Féin had a very, very successful election campaign in the Republic. They also are power sharing, obviously, in the north. The argument for Sinn Féin has always been that they might have more success politically by getting into power both north and south of the border and then calling for a referendum for a united Ireland than they would do by continuing the armed struggle. And equally, if you look at why the armed struggle ended, partly it was because they were sufficiently infiltrated by the British security services, partly because it wasn't seen as having many more concessions, that as a political tactic, it had kind of run out of steam. So that meant that both the political option was more attractive and continuing with the armed struggle was less attractive. By the way, one of the very best nonfiction books I've ever read, and particularly read it in the last year, is something called Say Nothing, which is about the history of the armed struggle in Northern Ireland and particularly sort of research on it. And I'd very much recommend it to you all, especially about the disappeared, who were a big cause of consternation and publicity around the armed struggle in the north. So what would be the proximate causes that would set it off? It would only be if for some reason that there decided to be a border, a hard border in the north. It looks as though that basically Boris Johnson has sold out the Unionists and Protestants in Northern Ireland by essentially giving ground on that. So it's unlikely to come back unless something terrible happens. And there's essentially Northern Ireland is going to have regulatory alignment with the rest of the EU and the Republic of Ireland. What that might do, however, is change the calculation of the kind of middle voters in the north. So it used to be that if you were a kind of a secular but non-committed Protestant or a secular liberal Catholic, you looked at the Republic and you said, well, there's anti-abortion laws, they don't allow gay marriage, the economy's not as good as here, why would we want to join the Republic? The Republic had liberalized a lot in terms of all those things, and the economy has grown a lot comparatively to the north, which means joining the Republic is a bit more of an attractive option than it was previously. What it could be is the violence might actually come in the other direction, that if we see over the next decade or two increasing calls for the north just to join the Republic and essentially join formally the EU rather than just being aligned to it, you might see a minority of people in the north who are kind of diehard members of want to be part of the United Kingdom. If they are, if it's agreed that they could go and join the Republic of Ireland, I imagine you might see violence resisting that. I would hope that there'd be enough wisdom on both sides to make it a sufficiently attractive proposition and to give safeguards in various ways that they might see it as in their interests to not make that mistake, but remains to be seen.
All right, it looks like we're all out of questions for now. So we can probably just leave it there. But Simon, thank you so much. Really so grateful to you. Such a wonderful lecture. Really appreciate your time. Thank you, Linda Cole and James Farrell for co-sponsoring, for collaborating on this event. And thank you all for attending.
Just to say, I know James has put his email address in the chat. Do get in touch with the London office. They do some absolutely amazing work. Whether you're a current student or an alum, it's a pleasure always interacting with them, and they've got so much on. Equally, as James said, not just Joe Biden is the only president around. I am, of course, a president of the Alumni Club in London. And if you ever if you're ever in London, planning to be in London, looking for jobs in London, whatever it might be, do reach out. I'm on sradford@usc.edu, or James or Emily can put you in touch with me. I'd be delighted to either field more questions about this or even just to say hello and have a chat. So do get in touch if you'd like to. And thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to listen to me warble on. I really appreciate your time and attention and being with me today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and evening. Bye.